Hi everybody. Today's mini lecture is going to discuss the concepts of power, authority, and legitimacy. And of course, all of that in the context of politics. So let's jump right into it. What is power? Power is the ability of somebody to make someone else do something that the first person wants them to do by using various means. So the definition is that power is the ability of A to make B do something that A wants, even if B doesn't want to do that. And you can use different means or different tools to do that. Now, some of those tools include coercion, right? If I want you to do something and you're not willing to do that, maybe I have force, maybe I can use force or some other form of coercion to make you do whatever it is that I want you to do. Another way of exercising power is using persuasion, investing the time to make sure that the other side understand why it is important that they do what you want them to do. And then finally, there is this concept of construction, which is related to persuasion, where I construct a framework that has sticks and carrots that make you want to do whatever it is that I want you to do. So I don't have to hold a gun to your head, and I don't have to spend hours explaining why it is important. I just tell you, if you do the work, you get a good grade. If you don't do the work, the grade is lower. So that's another way of exercising power over somebody else. Now, when we think about what are those sources of power, why does somebody have power over others or over another person? There are different sources of power. They start with physical force or the force of the wallet, money, if I'm wealthier, right? I can have a piece of information that you are really interested in, and that gives me leverage and power over you. There is this idea of attractiveness. If we want to be like somebody else, that gives them, again, leverage and power over us. And of course, there are legal and institutional status. So, for example, in this classroom, I'm the professor. That gives me some sort of power over you. And of course, we can look at that. We can expand that into community, local, and national politics as well. Sometimes I have allies that will give me power. Sometimes people get the power just because they have very strong resolve. They're very insistent and they're going to continue and do something again and again and again. You can think about the tantrum that a 2 or 3-year-old throws to their parents when they really want them to get them something. But that's a way of exercising power as well. Now you can pause here for a second and think about other sources of power that you know about. But the truth of the matter is that in any relationship, personal, community, workspace, and again, government and public relations, we can see a combination of those sources of power at work. It is interesting to note that in international politics, in international relations, we often talk about 2 or 3 kinds of power. We talk about hard power, just force, military force. Who has more tanks, who has more sophisticated weapons and missiles, that gives them more power over the other. And economics, who has a stronger economy, is tied into that. But it also is tied to the second kind of power, which is soft power, and this is the ability of one country to influence other countries not by using force. So economics draws into that, the attractiveness of this idea that other countries want to be like my country, and just respect in the international community. All of those things work into the soft power of a country. And then finally, and in more recent year, we talk about this idea of smart power, where a country will have both the actual force, but also a lot of sources of soft power, and will know when to apply each of those sources of power. Because obviously, some cases require the threat of a military action, while other can be resolved very easily just by talking with like-minded people. Now, if we take this whole discussion of power was good for politics and any other sphere, but if we just try to focus on power in politics, we know that power can be a way, or we can use power to develop the best common solution to a common problem. And this is how we channel power through rationality. So I have an idea, and I think that's the best solution to a problem. And so I will convince you, I will persuade you, and I will walk you in a rational way to arrive at that same conclusion and allow me to do whatever it is that I want to do. But power is, of course, also a way to dominate others. And again, there are overlapping spheres here. Can we talk about pure rationality, or are we dealing with things that are more, complex, and there is some domination and some of that rational process work into that? Think about the question of why many people in the United States do not vote. Even in this most recent presidential elections, that was highly contested, and we got to very high turnout of voting, it was still low compared to other countries. And so there are at least two explanations for that. One of them would say that people don't vote because, they may not be perfectly happy with everything the government do, but all in all, they are satisfied. They believe that things are going the way that they should go. And so that's a choice, right? But also, we can think that, or we can argue that the system in the United States, or in many states in the United States, is flawed and actively discourage participation and discourage people from going to vote. Think about, a simple item such as in the United States, election day is never a day off. In most other countries, it is either a day off or elections are happening on a Sunday, or a Saturday, a day where most people usually do not work, and so that by arguably institutionalize an incentive to go and vote. While in the United States, you have to go and do your own business, get to work, earn your money, and then find time to vote within that framework as well. And so we try to explain why people are not voting, and we can do that in both of those ways. And they are both related to power. Now, like everything else, and as I said before, there's a lot of overlapping forces that are working here. It could be that both are true, that there is a structural component to it, that lead to elite domination, but also that people in general are satisfied, or at least that they're not unhappy enough. Now, we explain what power is, but power is kind of the raw material, what countries usually use to rule over a population, what governments usually use is authority. So power, when we talk about power, a lot of time we do think about coercion. But when we talk about authority, we're thinking about the consent, right? So authority can be backed up by coercion. So we still have a police force. But authority, a government that enjoys authority, gets a great deal of power by consent from the people. Think about the very simple example of when you drive on the road, why do you stop in a red light? Do you do it because you see a police officer standing in the street corner? Maybe, but most of us just do that because we believe that that's how the system works. So that's where we are supporting the authority of our government, right? If you think about it, of course, there are people who break the law every day, but most people, most of the time, obey most of the laws and therefore obey the authority of the government. Where does that authority come from? There are traditional values and customs, and this is how we've been doing things, and this is mostly associated with a monarchy. Kings, they're always ruled the dynasty of the king, and this is how things are done, and we respect. If you look at the UK, even nowadays, when the Queen is not a decision-making authority in the country, people look up to the Queen and to the royal family and watch them all the time, right? There's also a charismatic authority that's usually is derived from the personality of a leader. And this is where we see a lot of the dictators come in, because they rely only, it's the cult of the person, the cult of the personality. People worship a person, not a system, not an institution, not this is how we're doing things. We are following a certain person, and whatever that person says is right. So we provide them power and authority. And then finally, there is the legal or rational authority, which is usually based in a constitution or a very rich and historical legal framework. And this is where we see a lot of the democracies operating at that level. Now, we talked about power, we talked about authority. Governments, stable governments, usually enjoy legitimacy on top of that. So they have the power, they have the authority, and they also have legitimacy. And that is the belief of people that the government or the leaders should have the authority. We don't wake up every morning and ask, should the federal government have the authority and power that they have? We kind of accept that. And so we provide the government legitimacy. And how can a government get that legitimacy, which is a very strong and powerful currency in politics? They can do that in one or a combination of ways. First of all, and probably the strongest one, is results. When a government provides results, people will support it. People will give that government the legitimacy. Even in cases, I think the chapter that you read looked at Hitler's government in the 1930s, even when there is a controversial personality at the head of the government, or when some of the policies of the government are not accepted, if there are results, if people's lives are good, if they feel secure and safe and they have a job, etc., that is a very powerful source of legitimacy to any government. Another source of legitimacy are just habits. So if we have a very long-standing tradition of our government has been there and has been doing those things, we kind of tend to go along with that. It's much harder to break away from 200 or 500 standing tradition, or even 50 years standing tradition, than it is from 2-month tradition. Of course, there are the procedures and institutions that come with the Constitution, or a constitution. And again, we'll talk about constitutions later on in a lot more detail. And this is where some self-imposing limits of government, right? If government has the power and the authority and the legitimacy, arguably it can break away and penetrate areas of life where we might want to keep private and not public. For example, who can we marry? What can we do in our free time? What God can we worship? Should we or can we worship a God at all? And this is where we see the civil and political rights, what we call nowadays, which are self-imposed limits that some governments put on themselves in order to gain legitimacy and therefore authority, allowing the government to exercise its powers. Now, if a government doesn't have results because it's too new and therefore doesn't have habits, and also the institutions are very young, sometimes we just rely on the identity of powerful leaders. The chapter brought up the case of George Washington with the newly created United States of America. The legitimacy of the government came because people believed in George Washington. Okay, so on Wednesday we'll develop some of those themes a little bit more. So make sure to watch and read everything that is listed in week 2 before we meet on Wednesday. And I'll see you then.